Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another PowerPoint lecture. This time we're going to be looking at the so-called age of Western imperialism. So we're going to be basically looking at mostly the new imperialism. This is the latter part of the 19th century, but we will be going back and looking a little bit more at sort of what preceded it in order to make that compare-contrast between the older colonial forms of imperialism and the imperialism of the late 19th century. Here's a little image of the Durbar of British imperialism in India in the late 19th century. That's going to be a big focus of ours, largely because not only is India a good example of not only the way in which a liberal empire could be constructed, but also how it transitions to a more paternalist empire. And then the process of decolonization is also very interesting in British India. So, the era of early modern European expansion, which we know so well. This is the conflict, let's say, between the French and the British in North America, the establishment of trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean basin largely, the rivalry between the French and the British on the Indian subcontinent. That era of colonization had really been stalled at the time of the French Revolution. There were some territorial adjustments that occurred as a result of that. For instance, the British were able to, in some ways, pick the corpse of parts of, anyway, the Dutch overseas empire. The British acquisition of South Africa, for instance, was part of the Napoleonic Wars, trying to handicap one of France's major ally, the Dutch Republic, during the Revolutionary period and the Napoleonic period. We also see, for instance, the attempt by the French in the post-revolutionary era in the 1830s, their takeover of Algeria and Tunisia. Italian interests beginning in Libya, but not really culminating until the beginning of the 20th century. Issues over the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and European influence slowly gaining across the rest of North Africa. So there, there are a number of issues with early modern colonization. Certainly, the independence movements in Latin America and the collapse of a large global Spanish empire. The Portuguese largely lost their empire in the Indian Ocean to mostly the Dutch, especially in Indonesia. And so as a result of this, by 1820 or so, the world's great empire was the British Empire. By this time, the Qing Empire in East Asia had really begun to experience a great deal of weakness. So really the British are the movers and shakers in the imperialism movement, and other European states, as well as non-European states, the Japanese and the United States for that matter, will be playing catch-up. The British Empire in the early 19th century was dominated by the ideals of liberalism. So it was an empire of free trade. The idea was to create a zone, a global zone, in which free trade was the mantra. No longer the kind of the mercantilist ideal where the mother country would extract resources from the colonies and then make finished goods at home to sell to a largely European market. But the idea that within the empire there would be trade back and forth, and many of the liberals would even say is that once that imperialism is a condition almost of sort of like almost like childlike tutelage. You bring these sort of pre-modern economies out of their backwardness. You make them more Western in a way, and then you let the colonies go, and they can now be new markets for free trade among sovereign states. That is one liberal ideal. And there's no question that in that liberal ideal, there is a very significant Eurocentric outlook. That India is backward, it's childlike, it's pre-modern. It needs to be brought into a sense of a new age of European modernity, and then the world will be well. We should not confuse liberalism with a kind of progressive ideology of the sort of relative equality of all cultures. No, 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 no. Liberalism had a very at this when it's applied to imperialism has a very specific agenda and a very specific set of cultural assumptions. So, and really, what fuels the free trade empire is the Industrial Revolution. It allows for, or it requires that a number of resources, a number of tools be used in that kind of imperialism and warfare, military conflict is one aspect of it. If markets will not open peacefully, markets must be forced open. The British are always looking for ways to force open markets. Slavery and the slave trade. The British become in East Africa, for instance, in the era after the 1820s, and 30s. Once the slave trade is banned in the British Empire in 1807. Once slavery is outright banned in the British Empire after 1832, there's no question that the British then become kind of crusaders to end slavery, which makes sense from a liberal standpoint. You don't want to be in a competitive free trade market against other civilizations that have a slave labor basis. That's kind of antithetical to the whole sense of a capitalist economy. Anyway, so therefore the British are going to use slavery and outlawing slavery and bringing slavery to an end in various parts of the world as their entry point, and expanding their sort of imperialist ambitions. So in East Africa, the British are going to get involved there in areas to end slave trade, and if that means having to have an armed garrison in that particular region in order to ensure that slavery doesn't come back again, then they'll keep that armed garrison there, effectively creating a British sphere of influence in that particular region. Another example of how free trade works in this, in the 1820s and 30s, after the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the opium market in China is really exploding. Opium in certain parts of urban eastern China is the drug of choice, and the British have a way of cultivating lots of opium in their northwestern frontiers in India, modern-day Afghanistan. So the British are going to have this sort of department of British imperial rule in India that's about the cultivation of opium for sale in the Chinese markets. Well, when the Emperor of China says, no, we don't like this, this is bad for our people, this is bad for our economy, this is bad for the overall health of our empire, they shut down the importation of opium. The British say, no, 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 this is about free trade. There is a market for this. The government should not step in and ban any kind of commodity. If there's demand for it, that demand must be supplied. And so the British will fight a series of the so-called opium wars against China in order to gain access to those markets and ensure that the opium department of the British Raj will still be alive and well in China. And now, another aspect of when we talk about British imperial dominance in terms of free trade, we also have to look at a certain point, though, the British do start. There's a conflict in terms of the ideology of empire as the 19th century progresses, and there is a shift towards a more paternalist view of what empire ought to be. We'll see this in particular a shift in British India after the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857. What essentially happens is the liberals begin to fall from power in terms of their control of imperialism, and the idea that an empire should be sort of this protective space of these very childlike indigenous populations where the imperialist motherland protects them, keeps them well, fosters relations within that community of nations, shall we say, is really the goal of the so-called paternalist empire. Now, there's one thing that's very interesting about that. As much as that suggests, okay, you nice little Indian people, pat you on the head, run along with your bowl of rice, and just be good, obedient little subjects of Westminster and of the Queen Empress. At the same time, it also allows Indians to be Indian. It doesn't require that they change their customs and traditions. It doesn't require that they come out of the so-called backwardness of their pre-modern inert society, as the liberals would have it. So there's good and bad on both sides of the imperial debate in terms of what it will allow. Benjamin Disraeli very much sort of cultivates this idea, who is one of the fathers of the paternalist empire. Disraeli is really very interested in making India as Indian as it possibly could be, and really promoting the idea of the sort of the local indigenous population and rulers, the Maharajas and the Gaikwams and so on. The British settler colonies are a different category altogether. That's a nice way of what is traditionally referred to as the white colonies. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all of which are granted dominion status by the turn of the 19th and 20th century. That means that basically home rule, or the idea that granting these countries a degree of autonomy within the British imperial system, is in the offing. Okay? This is very much the achievement of the liberal empire, that Canada is no longer going to be subject directly to everything that the British government in Westminster has to say. The Canadians will have their own prime minister. The Queen will remain the head of state. The same is true for Australia and New Zealand. The interesting question in all of this was, though, if Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the so-called white dominions, were all granted this status of dominions, why not Ireland? And that was a big question for the Liberal government of William Ewart Gladstone at the end of the 19th century. And of course, the British decided that Ireland shouldn't be granted the same status, to disastrous consequences for Anglo-Irish relations in the early 20th century. Okay. Here we have some images of the Opium Wars, modern British warships destroying a Chinese navy. Okay. So the focus then of virtually all the British Empire is India. This is the crown jewel. It is always important for us to kind of remember that that Lord Cornwallis, who surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown in 1781, we would think is this general who's disgraced and has no career, and he goes back to Britain, he hangs his head in shame and so on, when in fact he ends up being one of the first governor generals of India. And I think that's remarkable in that it shows the shift between the British emphasis on its North American empire to India as the center point of its empire. And British imperial policy is all about creating buffer zones in the northwest, in Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan, and Afghanistan, in the east, in Burma, guarding the approaches to India, controlling Cape Colony at South Africa, so that British navies could have, on their way to India, would have a point to resupply at South Africa. Later on, ensuring that the Isthmus of Suez, before there's a canal there, the Isthmus of Suez does not fall into any kind of foreign aggressive hands, or declines into chaos and disorder. So, for instance, when Napoleon makes his move towards Egypt in the 1790s, the British are very much going to counteract that right away, because that's a threat to India, and that's what Napoleon intended. From a base in India, French fleets could be launched across the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean to threaten British supply lines there. Not good for the British Empire. Later on, when we begin to see Egypt breaking away from the Ottoman Empire and getting very heavily into debt, the British, fearing that maybe the French, again, or the Russians somehow might try to take control of Egypt. This was absolutely off the table for the British. The British would step in the early 1880s and create a protectorate out of Egypt. Russian expansion from Central Asia southward is going to be of a great cause for alarm in Britain, because it could potentially threaten British India. So any number of geopolitical scenarios were constantly rehashed in the halls of power in Whitehall in London, in order to protect this central, most important part of the British Empire. The whole idea of controlling Africa from literally the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo, that Cape to Cairo idea that the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes talked about. The Cape to Cairo strategy was to control not only the course of the Nile River and all points along the way in order to guarantee control of India, but then also South Africa and its strategic, its strategic military importance, really. The question then will become, when India goes away, when India is granted independence in 1947, what is the justification then for the rest of that empire? And the answer in the 1950s in Britain was, there is no justification for it. And thus the process of decolonization will accelerate. But for the short term, in the short term, British control of India, there were numerous challenges. A very heterogeneous population, Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and various ethnic groups that we all like today to lump together as calling them Indians or calling them Hindu or something like that. Absolutely, each little regional state has its own very, whether you're Bengalese or you're from Mysore or you're from Cochin on the coast, or Gujarat in the northwest. These are all very, very different types of people with different traditions. One must remember that to some extent, Hinduism is not a highly unified, highly centralized religion. In many ways, Hinduism is the result of an amalgam of all these local traditions and customs that we see throughout a very diverse Indian subcontinent. Along with that is complex social and economic conditions. Some areas of the interior are, we could call, very underdeveloped. Some places in the northwest frontier are mineral rich. There's plenty of cotton producing regions, cotton cloth, dyed cotton cloth, printed cotton cloth coming out of India. It's one of their leading exports. It's one of the reasons why the British love to get into India in the beginning, because they have access to this valuable commodity. Eventually, the British will shut down Indian home-produced printed cotton. We'll have Indians simply cultivate that cotton and then make that cloth back in mills in Lancaster and Manchester and the industrial Midlands of Britain. So that Manchester will become Cottonopolis. And in many ways, the skill will be lost in India itself. The vehicle for British control over India, though, is the East India Company. And this is a little bit hard for us to imagine, that a company would be charged with imperial rule. We think of empires as being state-controlled. And yet this is very much part of the idea of the liberal empire. It's the East India Company that is tasked with governing India. So it's not the British regular army that's going to go in there in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s. It's the India Company Army. They were not employed by the government back in Westminster. Occasionally, the Westminster government would be influential in appointing board of directors over the East India Company, but that's about it. They were very interested in the affairs of the East India Company, but it was an autonomous, profit-making enterprise. And the whole goal of the East India Company was to do just that, was to make a profit. And so therefore you could say that its best interest was not necessarily in good governance. It was whatever was going to make the most money. um, the India Company, as a result of that, is going to hit a major snag in 1857 when they have a major uprising on their hands of a native contingents, so-called sepoys. These are native Indians who serve in the East India Company Army. One of the things that the East India Company did was they, in order to increase the amount of revenue that they take out of India, they make all kinds of deals with local rulers. They start collecting the land tax for them, and they make a profit on collecting the land tax. We call that tax farming. So any number of issues, any number of things to make this money, and all these deals with local rulers and granting special privileges to folks from this place and to that place and so on. Well, by the early 1850s, the India Company realizes that some of those deals that were struck in the early 19th century weren't really working anymore, and so they start revoking some of those good sweetheart deals that were granted to local rulers. This angers a portion of the population called the sepoys, mostly from some of the northern territories in India, angers them, and there are a couple of other issues too. For instance, the British Army issues a musket cartridge that is greased with, that is held together with a grease that is made from both pig fat and cow fat, which of course is going to make both Muslims and Hindus absolutely hit the roof on that one. And it wasn't so much that they did that, but then it was just sort of this blithe attitude where you just say, oh, well, you superstitious, backward Indian person who doesn't know any better, why don't you get over these superstitious practices? It's that attitude then that really led to the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. The Sepoy Rebellion then challenges the whole idea, the whole rationale for British rule in India. Is it going to be a liberal empire? Does that work? Has the liberal empire really worked? Has the East India Company been effective? And when regular British troops have to be sent into India, regular British Army troops are sent into India to bail out the company. That essentially ends company rule. The company is disbanded, and now the Westminster government will take over the rule, the British Raj in India. And now we'll begin to see the shift towards a more paternalistic empire under the influence of the conservatives in Parliament and Benjamin Disraeli. So right there, that very element, it really causes the questioning of, is liberalism compatible with imperialism? Many would argue that underneath the glitzy paternalism of Disraeli's empire, in which the Queen Victoria is made Empress of India, underneath all that, there still beats the heart of a liberal empire that's about making money and maximizing profits. At the same time, in all practical purposes, that empire is going to be gone. Here we have a view of the Sepoy Mutiny, and you see actually troops on both sides here. I think you actually do have some sepoys over here that have remained loyal to the British. And then these troopers here, you actually see some in red tunics here. These are definitely sepoys in mutiny against the British government. Okay. All right. And here's a look at the expansion of British rule up to the time of the Sepoy Mutiny. And really, it's this acquisition here in the Northwest that's most important. But again, you see there are also these tributary states, the Marathas and Hyderabad and Mysore down here, Awadh over here. That's where a lot of the sepoys came from, and that independent status that ends by 1856 is one of the reasons why the mutiny happens the way it does. But the fact that British rule will continue this way, that there will be local populations whose rulers will coordinate with Britain, but who will not be under direct British imperial supervision. All right, I think that's going to end up being, yes, that's going to be a good stopping point for us. So we're going to pause there, and we will go on to another portion of this lecture. And so stay tuned for the next installment. But for now, however, thank you very much for listening.